In the year 2147, Earth's place among the stars was still novel but rapidly growing. After centuries of slow progress, humanity had finally reached the stars, and Horizon Point, a massive space station orbiting the gas giant Jupiter, served as one of the largest trading hubs for human and alien races alike. It floated in the inky void like a spider in its web, glimmering with artificial lights and crisscrossed with docking arms for starships of every make and size. For Captain Myra Danvers, the station's commander, each new diplomatic mission was a delicate dance between diplomacy and survival. But nothing had prepared them for the Vestrai. Rumors of the Vestrai had reached Earth long before their arrival. They were the epitome of an advanced species, feared and revered throughout the galaxy for their technological prowess. Their ships, according to legend, could manipulate the very fabric of time and space. Their cities floated, unsupported by anything as archaic as land, and their societal infrastructure was a marvel of design: no crime, no poverty, no war. The Vestrai had transcended such petty struggles long ago, and they were known to look down on species still bound by the constraints of what they deemed lesser technology. For days, Horizon Point had buzzed with nervous anticipation as the Vestrai vessel approached. It was sleek and impossibly smooth, a long, dark blade cutting through the stars. Its surface shimmered with a faint, otherworldly energy that the station's scanners could barely interpret. This was the most advanced ship they had ever seen, far beyond even the cutting-edge technology Earth had recently developed. Captain Danvers stood in the observation bay, staring out at the alien ship as it eased into the docking berth. Beside her, the senior officers of the station whispered among themselves, each of them secretly dreading the meeting that was about to take place. "Looks like a giant chrome beetle," Joe Harper, the station's lead mechanic, remarked casually, leaning against the bulkhead. He was the odd one out in the room, his grease-streaked jumpsuit clashing with the pristine, formal uniforms of the others. His face was set in his usual scowl, his hands jammed into the pockets of his tool belt, and a faint smudge of engine oil traced a line across his forehead. Danvers turned to him, her face a mask of professionalism. "You might want to keep the commentary to yourself, Joe. The Vestrai aren't known for their sense of humor." Joe snorted, adjusting the heavy multi-tool on his belt. "Just saying. I don't see what the fuss is about. We've had plenty of aliens come through here. This lot just has fancier toys. Fancy toys that could probably vaporize this station in the blink of an eye," Lieutenant Draven, the station's chief security officer, said under his breath. He was watching the Vestrai ship with cold, wary eyes. "Let's not provoke them." Joe rolled his eyes, but kept his thoughts to himself. He had no love for the pomp and ceremony that came with these diplomatic meetings. As a mechanic, he lived in the underbelly of the station, down where things were dirty and broken, where his hands-on expertise actually mattered. Diplomats and captains could keep their politics and posturing. He fixed things that needed fixing. It was simple, clean, efficient. A soft chime echoed through the station's corridors, signaling the arrival of the Vestrai. The tension in the room thickened as the airlock hissed open. Captain Danvers straightened her jacket, taking a deep breath before stepping forward to greet their guests. The Vestrai emerged from the airlock in a shimmering procession. They were tall and impossibly slender, their skin a pale, almost translucent white that seemed to glow in the artificial light. Their movements were graceful, fluid, as though they moved through water instead of air. Each of them wore long robes that shifted in color with their movements, reflecting the surrounding light in ripples. Their eyes, large and almond-shaped, held an intense, unblinking gaze that made even the most hardened officers uneasy. Leading them was Ambassador Valen, who was taller than the rest, his robes a deeper shade of silver that gleamed like polished metal. His expression was serene, but there was a palpable arrogance in the way he carried himself, as though he expected the humans to fall to their knees in awe. Captain Danvers, Valen's voice was soft but rang with authority. The universal translator, embedded within the station's systems, instantly converted his alien language into flawless English. We appreciate your hospitality in allowing us to dock at your station. Captain Danvers inclined her head respectfully. Ambassador Valen, it's an honor to have the Vestrai aboard Horizon Point. Welcome. Valen's eyes scanned the room, taking in the human officers with mild disinterest until they landed on Joe Harper. His gaze lingered on the mechanic's tool belt, filled with traditional, handheld instruments. Valen raised a thin, delicate eyebrow. "What, may I ask, are those?" he inquired, his voice laced with bemused curiosity. Joe blinked, taken aback. "Tools," he said flatly. Valen's mouth curved into a faint smile, as though he had just heard a child describe a simple toy. "Tools?" He repeated the word with exaggerated wonder. "Ah, I see. Your people still use such physical devices? How quaint." The other Vestrai, standing behind Valen, exchanged glances and subtle smiles, clearly sharing in their leader's amusement. Joe's expression hardened, but before he could respond, Captain Danvers cut in smoothly. "Human technology may appear simple compared to the wonders of the Vestrai, Ambassador, but we've found it effective in maintaining our station and ships. Our engineers are quite resourceful." Valen nodded slowly, but his eyes never left Joe, as if the sight of such crude tools was a spectacle he could hardly comprehend. "Resourceful, yes. But one day, you will learn that there are far greater ways to manipulate the physical world. Tools," he waved a hand dismissively, "are relics of a bygone era." Joe's jaw tightened, but he forced a grin. "Guess some of us are just old-fashioned." Valen inclined his head ever so slightly, the gesture dripping with polite condescension. "Indeed. But there is something to be said for the charm of simpler times." He turned to Danvers, the subject clearly dismissed. "Shall we proceed to the conference room, Captain?" "Of course, Ambassador," Danvers replied, gesturing toward the corridor. As the Vestrai delegation glided past, Joe muttered under his breath, "Arrogant pieces of work." Danvers gave him a sharp look. "Careful, Joe. These aren't the kind of aliens you want to get into a pissing contest with." Joe just shrugged. "Their ship breaks down, we'll see who's laughing." Captain Danvers smiled despite herself. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." But as the Vestrai vanished down the corridor, she couldn't help but feel a knot of tension forming in her gut. The Vestrai were powerful, advanced, and undeniably proud of it. And in a universe where everything had its limits, Danvers had a feeling that their pristine technology might not be as flawless as they liked to think. She glanced at Joe, who was already heading back to the maintenance bays. The mechanic with his old-fashioned tools might just have a part to play in this encounter after all. 3 days after the Vestrai's arrival, Horizon Point returned to its usual rhythm. The initial buzz surrounding the alien delegation had worn off, and the crew settled back into their routines. Captain Myra Danvers, though relieved that the diplomatic talks were progressing smoothly, remained on edge. Something about the Vestrai unnerved her, not just their superiority complex, but the way they seemed so utterly convinced of their invulnerability. In the days since the Vestrai docked, their ship remained a source of curiosity for the human engineers. They were forbidden from running deep scans on it, as per the Vestrai's strict instructions, but even the superficial data they could collect was mind-boggling. The ship's hull seemed to be made of some exotic alloy, nearly impenetrable by human scanners, and its power systems operated on principles that no human engineer could fully comprehend. Joe Harper had tried to ignore the spectacle. He spent most of his time working in the depths of the station, performing routine maintenance on the aging systems of Horizon Point. The station, for all its importance in human space travel, was still held together with what Joe liked to call spit and duct tape. While humanity had made incredible leaps in spacefaring technology, Horizon Point was an old relic, its infrastructure strained by years of use and expansion. For every gleaming, advanced system, there was another one patched together by sheer force of will and human ingenuity. That was where Joe came in. He didn't need fancy tools or cutting-edge gadgets, just a solid wrench, a steady hand, and a keen understanding of how machines worked. But as much as he tried to focus on his work, the Vestri were never far from his mind. Their sneering comments about human tools had gotten under his skin. He had dealt with condescending visitors before, but there was something uniquely infuriating about the Vestri's smugness. He couldn't shake the image of Ambassador Valen's face as he had mocked his tools, as if Joe himself were some kind of ancient relic. It was late into the station's artificial night cycle when disaster struck. Joe was working on a faulty plasma relay deep in the bowels of the station when the first alarm blared. His comm unit crackled to life, and a frantic voice came through Lieutenant Draven, the station's security chief. "Joe, we've got a situation. Get up to the control room, now." Joe wiped his hands on his jumpsuit, the urgency in Draven's voice sending a jolt of adrenaline through him. He bolted up the ladder, moving through the narrow maintenance corridors with practiced speed. By the time he reached the control room, the tension in the air was palpable. Captain Danvers stood in the center of the room, her face a mask of calm under pressure. The holodisplays around her showed the exterior of the station, and in the corner of the largest display, Joe saw the Vestri ship floating, unmoving, with several error codes flashing beside it. "What happened?" Joe asked, slightly out of breath. "The Vestri ship," Draven replied, pointing to the display. "They've lost power. They're dead in the water." Joe blinked. "You're kidding." "That thing?" Danvers crossed her arms, her eyes narrowed as she studied the display. "They sent a distress call a few minutes ago. Their propulsion system failed completely offline." Joe stared at the holodisplay, trying to process the impossibility of it. The Vestri had bragged endlessly about their flawless technology, about how their ships were beyond human comprehension, yet here they were stranded. "They've been trying to reboot the systems for the past hour," Draven continued. "No luck." Danvers turned to Joe. "I need you to go over there and see if you can help." Joe raised an eyebrow, incredulous. "Help? With what?" "They were pretty clear about not needing our primitive tools." "I don't care what they said," Danvers replied, her voice firm. "Their ship is in our docking bay, and if something goes wrong over there, we're the ones who will have to deal with it. I need you to see what you can do." Joe exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, I'll go. But I'm not making any promises. Their ship's probably too advanced for me to even know where to start." Danvers nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I know." Just do what you do best. By the time Joe made his way to the docking bay, the atmosphere had shifted. The Vestri delegation, so poised and untouchable just days before, now moved with an air of quiet panic. Technicians rushed to and from the ship, speaking rapidly in their own language, trying to make sense of the malfunction. Ambassador Valen stood at the center of the chaos, his usual serene expression replaced with something darker: frustration, perhaps even fear. When he saw Joe approach, his face tightened with visible discomfort. "You," Valen said, his voice clipped. "What are you doing here?" "Captain Danvers sent me to help," Joe replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Heard you've got some engine trouble." Valen's lips pressed into a thin line. "Our propulsion system has malfunctioned. We are handling it." Joe nodded slowly, glancing at the ship. "How's that going for you?" Valen's eyes narrowed. "Our ship operates on technology far beyond your comprehension, human. We do not need your assistance." Joe raised his hands in mock surrender. All right. Just offering." He started to turn away, but one of the Vestri technicians, her face pale and anxious, stepped forward. She spoke to Valen in their native tongue, her words quick and urgent. Valen listened, his expression growing more tense by the second. Finally, he sighed, his pride visibly warring with the reality of the situation. "Wait," Valen called out to Joe. Joe turned back, his eyebrow raised. "We." may require your expertise after all, Valen admitted, though the words seemed to leave a bitter taste in his mouth. Our systems are failing, and we cannot diagnose the problem. Your methods, while crude, may offer a different perspective. Joe allowed himself a small, satisfied grin. Sure thing, Ambassador. Let's take a look. He stepped aboard the Vestrai ship, immediately noticing the strange, almost organic design of the interior. The walls pulsed with soft light, and the air hummed with the energy of dormant systems. Joe could see why they considered their technology so advanced everything felt alive, as though the ship itself was a living entity rather than a machine. He made his way to the engine room, where the heart of the ship lay in silence. The propulsion system was enormous, its design unlike anything Joe had ever seen. Yet, despite the alien materials and the sleek design, it was still, fundamentally, a machine. And machines broke. Joe knelt down beside the propulsion core, his eyes scanning the readings on a nearby console. The Vestrai had been running diagnostic after diagnostic, each one returning the same results: catastrophic failure, system override, power flux. What's all this? Joe asked, pointing at the console. Valen stood nearby, arms crossed, his discomfort growing by the second. Our quantum phase shift drive is offline. We have attempted to recalibrate the system, but nothing seems to work. The system is beyond even our engineers. Joe crouched down, pulling a small scanner from his belt. Sounds like a phase misalignment to me. A what? Valen asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Joe didn't answer right away. Instead, he began carefully examining the phase coils, running his hands along the smooth surfaces. The ship's technology was advanced, sure, but it was still based on principles that Joe understood. In fact, it reminded him of early quantum drive systems humanity had experimented with decades ago, back when things were a lot more prone to breaking. You've got a flux compensator right next to the phase coils, Joe muttered, half to himself. Bad design. These things were probably generating way too much heat, causing an energy buildup. No wonder your system crashed. Valen stared at him, clearly not understanding a word of what Joe was saying. With a sigh, Joe pulled a tool from his belt and got to work. The Vestrai watched, their faces a mixture of doubt and disbelief, as Joe Harper, using nothing more than a simple set of human tools, began the task of saving their ship. The engine room of the Vestrai ship hummed faintly, an echo of its once flawless power. Joe Harper crouched by the propulsion system, his calloused hands busy as he examined the intricate machinery. The contrast between the alien technology and his simple tools was stark. The Vestrai propulsion system looked like something out of a dream, sleek, seamless, glowing with faint, pulsing lights that flowed along the smooth surfaces. And there Joe was, holding a wrench and a multi-tool as if he were about to fix an old earthbound tractor. Behind him, Ambassador Valen and a group of Vestrai engineers stood in a tight circle, watching him with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. The ambient lighting in the engine room dimmed, flickering slightly, a subtle reminder that the ship's power grid was operating on its last legs. Joe whistled low under his breath, running his fingers along a strange, almost liquid-like tube that connected two components of the propulsion system. It glowed softly, but the light was flickering like a dying light bulb. He muttered to himself as he worked, not caring if the Vestrai understood. All right. Let's see what's what here. Quantum phase shift drive, huh? Fancy name for something that still needs cooling like everything else in the universe. Do you have any idea what you're doing? Valen finally asked, his voice sharp. His patience was clearly wearing thin. This was a man, or rather, an alien who wasn't used to waiting for anything. Especially not for a human to fix his ship. Joe didn't bother looking up. I'm figuring it out. Don't worry. The Vestrai engineers exchanged looks. Valen sighed audibly, his arms crossed over his chest. We have tried every diagnostic, every recalibration sequence, and all of our redundant systems have failed. You can't possibly dash. Joe cut him off. Yeah, see, that's your problem. You're thinking too high-tech. You keep running diagnostics, expecting some perfect solution from your system. But your system's too perfect, that's why it crashed. Valen blinked. Too perfect? That is nonsense. Our technology is great, sure, but it's fragile. You build all this advanced tech on top of itself, and when one thing goes wrong, the whole system comes crashing down. I've seen it a million times, Joe said as he unplugged a bundle of glowing wires, causing a few sparks to shoot into the air. The Vestri gasped, clearly alarmed, but Joe remained unfazed. What are you doing? One of the engineers asked, horrified. That's the main power circuit for your flux compensator, Joe finished for him, placing the wires carefully to the side. It's drawing too much current from your phase coils. You've got a power imbalance, that's what's causing your systems to shut down. You are tampering with a system that is beyond your understanding, Valen snapped, his voice now tinged with anger. This ship, Joe interrupted, isn't gonna move until we fix that imbalance. You keep running your quantum diagnostics, but all the fancy coding in the world isn't going to solve this problem. This thing needs some good old-fashioned elbow grease. Valen opened his mouth to argue but then closed it, clearly frustrated. He was stuck. He didn't like it, but he needed Joe, and the mechanic knew it. Joe turned back to the propulsion system. The power readings were erratic, jumping wildly from low energy to dangerously high levels in an instant. It was no wonder the ship's propulsion had failed. This kind of instability would have caused a catastrophic overload if it hadn't shut itself down. All right, Joe muttered to himself. Here we go. He pulled out his torque wrench, carefully adjusting a series of glowing clamps that held the phase coils in place. As he worked, he explained his process, more for his own amusement than for the Vestri's benefit. You've got phase coils running your quantum drive, but you've got them too close to your heat regulators, Joe said, tightening one of the clamps. That's creating a feedback loop. Too much heat, too much energy, and the system doesn't know how to handle it. It's like overloading a circuit. Eventually, it's going to trip, and everything shuts down to prevent a meltdown. Valen frowned, the skepticism in his eyes now mixed with something else, reluctant curiosity. He clearly didn't understand Joe's methods, but it was also becoming clear that the human mechanic might actually know what he was doing. Joe paused, adjusting the calibrator in his hand. Let me guess, you've never had to fix anything like this before, have you? The silence from the Vestri was telling. They had never expected their ship to break down. Not like this. That's the thing about machines, Joe said, finally looking up at Valen. Doesn't matter how advanced they are, they still break. And when they do, sometimes you've got to get your hands dirty. The Vestri engineers shifted uncomfortably, clearly unaccustomed to the idea of getting their hands dirty. Joe went back to work, methodically realigning the phase coils and rerouting the power flow away from the overloaded compensators. The glowing lights around the propulsion system began to stabilize. The ship's internal hum grew stronger, more even. Joe allowed himself a small smile. Okay, that should do it, Joe said, stepping back. You're gonna want to start the system back up slowly. Don't push it too hard or you'll overload the coils again. Valen blinked, as if trying to comprehend what had just happened. You think it will work? Joe shrugged, wiping his hands on a rag. Only one way to find out. Fire it up. One of the Vestri engineers hesitated, then tapped a series of glowing controls on the nearby console. A low rumble resonated through the room as the ship's propulsion system slowly began to power up. The hum grew louder, more intense, and for a moment, there was nothing but the rising sound of energy. Then, suddenly, the ship roared to life. The propulsion system glowed brightly, and the once flickering lights in the engine room snapped back to full power. The entire room seemed to hum with renewed energy, and the subtle vibration of the ship's engines told Joe all he needed to know: it was working. Valen stared at the glowing propulsion core, his eyes wide with disbelief. The engineers exchanged stunned glances, clearly unsure of what to make of this human who had just fixed their seemingly unfixable ship. Joe crossed his arms, a satisfied grin on his face. Told ya. Sometimes it's not about how advanced your tech is. It's about knowing how to fix it when it breaks. Valen finally turned to Joe, his expression unreadable. There was no mistaking the reluctance in his voice as he spoke, but there was also something else, something that had been missing in their previous interactions. Respect. You have repaired our ship, Valen said slowly. In a matter of minutes. Something our finest engineers could not accomplish. Joe shrugged again, as if it were no big deal. Like I said, just needed a fresh set of eyes. You folks rely too much on your systems to tell you what's wrong. Sometimes, you've got to get hands-on. Valen hesitated, as though the words he was about to speak were unfamiliar and difficult. Perhaps. We have underestimated the value of such methods. Joe raised an eyebrow. You think? There was a long pause as Valen regarded Joe with a newfound seriousness. For the first time, the arrogance that had clouded every interaction between the Vestrai and humans seemed to lift, if only for a moment. You have our gratitude, Valen said quietly, bowing his head ever so slightly. You have saved our ship. Joe nodded, slipping his wrench back into his belt. All in a day's work. As he turned to leave the engine room, the Vestrai engineers parted, allowing him passage. They no longer looked at him with the mocking sneers of before. Instead, their eyes were filled with something else, acknowledgement of his skills, and perhaps even a grudging admiration. As Joe made his way back to the docking bay, the ship's engines roaring back to full life behind him, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. The Vestrai might have been more advanced, more sophisticated, but in the end, a mechanic with a wrench had saved them. And that was something they would never forget. Back on Horizon Point, the atmosphere had shifted. The hum of routine operations was punctuated by the soft murmurs of awe and disbelief. Word of Joe Harper's success had spread quickly, moving through the station like wildfire. The human mechanic had done the impossible. He'd repaired the Vestrai ship, a vessel so advanced that even its own engineers had been left helpless. And he had done it with nothing more than his hands and a toolkit. Captain Myra Danvers stood at the command deck, monitoring the readings from the Vestrai ship. Its systems were back online, running smoother than they had in hours. The once ominous dark silhouette now shimmered with renewed energy, its propulsion systems fully operational. But it wasn't just the ship's engines that had changed. Danvers could sense a shift in the Vestrai themselves. They're hailing us, Captain, Lieutenant Draven announced from his station, his voice carrying a hint of surprise. Danvers straightened her uniform, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Patched him through. The holographic screen blinked to life, and the familiar figure of Ambassador Valen appeared. He stood tall and composed, but there was something different about him. The arrogance that had once marked every expression was gone, replaced by a somber, respectful demeanor. Behind him, several Vestrai engineers were visible, their gazes fixed forward with newfound humility. Captain Danvers, Valen began, inclining his head slightly. We wish to formally express our gratitude for your assistance in resolving our technical difficulties. Danvers couldn't help but glance at Joe Harper, who stood to her right, his arms crossed, his grease-streaked jumpsuit a stark contrast to the polished, pristine surroundings. His face betrayed no emotion, though his eyes flickered with quiet satisfaction. It's nothing, Ambassador, Danvers replied, her voice smooth and diplomatic. We're just glad we could help. Valen's eyes shifted to Joe, and the faintest hint of a smile appeared on his thin lips. Your engineer has proven to be most resourceful. His methods, while unorthodox, have shown us that there is value in simplicity. Joe raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting such a direct acknowledgement from the Vestrai. He gave a casual nod. Glad I could be of service. Valen hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his next words carefully. It is rare that we encounter a species whose technology is so different from our own. Yet, in this instance, it appears that your tools, crude though they may be, were precisely what we needed. We have learned a valuable lesson. Joe's face softened slightly, and he scratched the back of his neck. Look, tech's great and all, but at the end of the day, a machine's a machine. It breaks, you fix it. Doesn't matter if it's quantum or analog. Valen inclined his head again, deeper this time. Indeed. It seems we have much to learn from your people. Danvers couldn't hide her surprise at the ambassador's words. The Vestri were a species known for their pride, for their unwavering belief in their superiority. For Valen to admit, even indirectly, that they had something to learn from humans was nothing short of revolutionary. We appreciate the sentiment, Ambassador, Danvers said, stepping forward. Perhaps this could mark the beginning of a more collaborative relationship between our species. Valen's expression brightened, though his formality remained intact. That would be agreeable. We will, of course, inform our leadership of your assistance. I believe they will be most interested in fostering stronger ties with Earth. Danvers nodded. We look forward to it. With a final nod, the hologram flickered and vanished, leaving the command deck in stunned silence. Draven let out a low whistle. Well, that's something I didn't expect to hear, he muttered. Joe, still leaning against the railing, uncrossed his arms and stretched, clearly unaffected by the diplomatic ramifications. I told you. Doesn't matter how shiny their ships are, they break just like everything else. Danvers smiled at him. Looks like you just earned us some serious diplomatic points, Joe. Joe shrugged. Just doing my job. You can keep the politics. But as he turned to leave the command deck, something stopped him. Valen and a group of Vestri engineers were entering the room, their tall forms gliding through the airlock with an air of purpose. It wasn't uncommon for alien dignitaries to visit Horizon Point, but something about this group felt different. The usual aura of superiority that the Vestri carried with them was noticeably absent. Valen stepped forward, his pale eyes locking on Joe. Engineer Harper, he said, his voice formal but no longer cold. May we have a moment of your time? Joe blinked, taken aback. Sure. Valen gestured to the group of engineers behind him. My crew wishes to learn from you. Your ability to identify the fault in our propulsion system so quickly has intrigued us. We would appreciate it if you could share some of your methods. Joe stared at the ambassador, unsure if he had heard correctly. The Vestri wanted to learn from him? From a human mechanic with a toolkit full of wrenches and screwdrivers? Danvers stepped in, her diplomatic instincts kicking in once again. I think that can be arranged, Ambassador. Joe has years of experience working with complex systems. He's one of the best. Joe scratched the back of his head, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention. Yeah, I guess I could show you a few things. But you're not gonna like it. There's a lot of manual work involved. Valen's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. We are willing to learn. Joe exchanged a glance with Danvers, who gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. With a sigh, he pulled out a spanner from his belt and gestured to the Vestri engineers. All right, let's get to work. Over the next few hours, the scene in the station's maintenance bay was something no one could have predicted. Joe Harper, the rough-and-tumble mechanic who had spent most of his career patching up old human starships, stood in the center of a group of highly advanced Vestri engineers, explaining the ins and outs of manual repairs. The Vestri listened intently, their delicate hands mimicking Joe's every movement as he showed them how to recalibrate systems manually, bypass faulty circuits, and identify weak points in the design. The Vestri, for all their sophistication, had never seen anything like it. They were used to systems that repaired themselves, to diagnostics that solved problems with a few commands. But here was a human, showing them that sometimes the most effective solutions weren't digital, they were physical. They involved rolling up your sleeves, getting your hands dirty, and solving the problem with intuition and experience, not just algorithms and automated systems. By the time the lesson was over, Valen approached Joe once more. The ambassador's expression had softened even further, and there was no trace of the condescension that had once marked their interactions. "Engineer Harper," Valen said quietly, "you have shown us that we still have much to learn. Your methods may be different from ours, but they are no less valuable. Perhaps, in the future, we could exchange more than just knowledge." Joe wiped his hands on his jumpsuit, a smirk playing on his lips. "Anytime, Ambassador. Just don't expect me to swap my tools for one of your fancy gadgets." Valen actually smiled, a rare and surprising gesture for a Vestrai. "Perhaps we will learn to appreciate your tools as much as you do." As the Vestrai delegation prepared to leave, Joe watched them with a newfound sense of respect, not just for their technology, but for their willingness to adapt, to learn from a species they had once deemed primitive. It wasn't every day that someone as stubborn as the Vestrai admitted they had something to learn. Back in the docking bay, Captain Danvers stood next to Joe as they watched the Vestrai ship slowly pull away from Horizon Point, its engines glowing with the same power that Joe had restored. She glanced at him, a knowing smile on her face. "You know," Danvers said, "they'll probably write about this in some galactic history book one day. The day the Vestrai learned to respect human tools." Joe snorted, shaking his head. "Don't care about history. I'm just glad their ship's out of here. Got a whole station of busted parts waiting for me." Danvers chuckled. "Well, if you ever need a break, I hear you've got some new alien friends who might be able to help out." Joe waved her off, heading back to the maintenance bay. Yeah. Let's see how they do with a real breakdown." As the Vestrai ship disappeared into the stars, the crew of Horizon Point returned to their duties, their heads held a little higher. The Vestrai had come to mock human tools, but they had left with a newfound respect for the ingenuity, resilience, and skill that came with them. And for Joe Harper, it was just another day at the office fixing things the old-fashioned way, one wrench turn at a time.